engagement in this work. To help me achieve one of my New Year's resolutions, Ginger is going to read the full statement aloud for us so that we've done that as we're supposed to. Sorry.
I'm struggling with my mute and my screen sharing today, so maybe I need to rethink my New Year's resolution. Okay. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula.
Terrific. Thank you, Ginger. And let me now formally call roll. Scott Bacon.
Here.
Senator Richard Briggs. Katie Core. Stan Harville.
Here.
Representative David Hawk.
I'm here.
Chris Lestos.
Here.
Lisa Trail.
Here.
Lynn Volz. And Amanda Waddell.
Here.
Terrific. There's Lynn Volz. Hello, Lynn. We just called roll. Can we get you to say that you're here? She's coming on here. Okay. Lynn, can you hear us? Not yet. Okay. So Ginger, we can mark her present, right? Okay, terrific. Let me give a quick overview of the time that we have together. We're going to start by looking at our list of must-haves that we created last time and see if anybody wants to add or subtract anything from that list. Then we're going to look at the draft framework that the state Department of Education sent out and see if we have any comments, things we want to add, or at least make sure we've considered with our own list. So look at our list, then look at the state's funding formula draft. Then we'll spend some time looking at our outcomes. Last time we just got started on that and we talked about EPSOs, particularly the Ready Grad indicators, then reading, and we didn't reach any resolution on whether we were going to focus on the outcomes as absolute or achievement based or on growth based or a combination thereof. So we need to consider that. And then the on-time completion of algebra. Those were the three that we talked about. The state draft included a number of others, including CTE, work-based learning, FAFSA completion, and JROTC. So I think those are all areas that we should at least consider for our own before we finalize our outcomes. And then we're hoping that we'll have the appearance of an expert. Ginger, am I looking at your head shaking yes, as that's going to happen?
Yes, that is going to happen. We're going to have Matthew Joseph from Excel in Ed joining us around noon.
Terrific. And I think that's an opportunity for all of us just to start thinking about the recommendations and that we want to make as a part of our final report. We have previously made comments about the weights and where we are with weights, where we are with issues of adequacy of funding, the public fund use of funding, particularly around the voucher issue, teacher compensation, and pre-K, voluntary pre-K. Those are all areas that we may want to talk to the expert, ask questions. We'll have about half an hour, I think, from 12 to 12:30, or let's see, 1 to 1:30 for those of us on the eastern side of the line. And then if we have a little bit of time left over, we had agreed on 12:30 to 12:45, just a little extra time. We should look at direct funding and what we want to say about direct funding. And then we'll close out. One thing I do want the committee to consider is whether we want to put aside another meeting time, perhaps Thursday the 27th, the day after our meeting on Wednesday the 26th, just in case we need some extra time. We can come back to that decision after we finish up today. So that's what I think we have for an agenda. Ginger, anything here that I missed or that you would help us by adding on the preview?
I think you've covered everything.
Okay, terrific. Let's look at that next slide then. And Ginger, does it make sense most now to put up our list of must-haves? And that's our list. And I guess the questions I have, is there anything after you've had a little bit of time, I guess we haven't met in 2 weeks, to look at the list, listen to other people. I know a lot of us have gone through, I think I made it to comment 904 just about 15 minutes ago. So there's been a lot of public comment. Anything anybody sees on our list that they want to take away, or something they've heard they want to add?
I just had one really quick comment. Because we did put numbers beside of some of those, like nurses, one in each building. Just my comment for that is, some of these buildings we're saying one per building, but you have schools that have 1,000 and you have schools that have 300. So I'm not sure if building is the right term to use on that, or if, but I understand where we came from. I mean, a minimum of one in each building is great, but nurses can't, I think we did it for a couple of things, social workers and nurses. Obviously, if you're dealing with a high school with 1,500 students, that's different than maybe a smaller school that has, a rural school that's 300 people in the school. So that was my only comment when I looked over it, was maybe saying the one in each building. The problem with it is I don't know the other word to say for that, if it's a number, because you also don't want to say one for every 500 and leave a building sitting empty without a nurse, because they're at 350 or 400. So.
And Dan, this is David. I was probably the one who put the language building out there, because I'm improving the ratio is one thing, but making sure that every student has access to medical care inside their building. So I was probably the one that put the building word in there. The ratios that the optimal ratio, I say optimal, the desired ratio we have right now is one nurse for every 750 students. Current funding is one nurse for every 3,000 students. So I probably put the language building out there. I'm fine to be more generic in the conversation, just to improve funding for nurses, improve the funding ratio for nurses, and if we can put a more generic term on that as opposed to per building.
And again, I'm not like dead set on taking it off. I just wanted to make sure that if that is a minimum, like, because I understand where you're coming from, there needs to be someone in the building to deal with the asthma and the diabetes and everything. It just needs to be that those buildings, like I said, the high schools that have 1,400 kids in them may need more than just, I don't want to meet the minimum and not be able to exceed that with some funding. That's my only.
So does what's the will of the group? With other positions, we have not had that qualification, right? It just says school counselors, mental health counselors. So we could take it out, or we could say meeting, and I don't know what the accepted organization is for those ratios, but there are some organizations that establish optimal ratios.
Dan, just lost everybody.
No, we got you.
Here we are. Dan, I think having a medical background, I have been staggered at what the nurses have to deal with in the schools. And we have 26 schools in our 2 districts, and annually, the nurses see about 135,000 visits. That's staggering. And one year, about 4 years ago, it was 150,000. So the schools have been school systems have been funding more nurses. The 1 in 3,000 is totally inadequate. 1 in 7, whatever that was, 750 is not adequate. So, I don't know what to put there, but I think we have to recognize that we've opened the schools to children who are very ill and who need care all the time. Insulin pumps, paraplegia, diabetes, just on and on and on. And so 1 in each building, I think, is minimal. I don't know if we want to get to numbers. You had mentioned, I think, what did you say, 750? I think that's probably not workable.
I'm wondering if, and Ginger, I'll look to you on whether we could do a little homework in the next week and find out what a good number is on that and insert that as part of our last meeting. Is that possible? Do we need to reach closure on this today?
I think ideally we would have closure on it today, but we can definitely add it to our document next week. But I think ideally today would be our final recommendations for those pieces.
Dan, one more thing I'd like to say, and that is that the foundation has been instrumental in putting telemedicine in every single school in our 2 districts. And we think that facilitates care, and it certainly does, but it's also time consuming. And so, I think 1 in 500 is much more reasonable. If we have to come up with a number today, that's probably what I would recommend. I think 1 in each building is fine. If there's a 300 student building, I think they still need a nurse there, but I think minimum is 1 in 500. I'd like feedback from the group on that.
Thanks, Lynn. Lisa, you looked like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I actually am okay with 1 in 750, only because it does lessen it so much from what it previously was. And I think sometimes we have to ask for what we think is reasonable versus the best. So maybe it is 1 in 750 with a minimum of 1 in each school building. So,
Thanks.
and do you understand an or situation with that? Because
minimum of 1 per building, 750, 1 to 750 otherwise. Stan, did you want to comment?
Yeah, while we're talking about nurses, we'll have to have this discussion about mental health workers, counselors, everybody else. We're asking the high school counselors to be career counselors, and there's one for every 300 or 400, you know, on a grade level there, and it's just not doable. So, you know, we're going to have this same discussion with those types of positions also.
Do we agree with Lisa's recommendation, which is one for each building, and if a building has more than 750 students, one per 750? Is that? We'll work out the language, but that was the intent, I think, Lisa. Is that right? Yeah. Do we have agreement on that?
I think it's too high, Dan, but you know, I understand we're going from 1 to 3,000. On the other hand, I will tell you that schools are funding this currently, and it's one per building. So, you know, I don't know if we need to compromise at all on the numbers. I think 1,500 is more reasonable, but you know, I think 1 in 750 for a base, you know, I think it's too many, but I understand the position.
Representative Hawk, were you going to speak to that?
Well, I share Lynn's concerns completely, and I saw where Chris put in the chat that the nurses, the National Nurses Association suggests, and that's the reason I've had legislation prior that says one nurse for every 750 students. Lynn, I think you're exactly right. I think even that number is too high, which is why I think that we can use Lisa's suggestion and say nurses. One in each building with a ratio of 1 to 750 students in larger buildings would be a very good, a good middle ground to take on this particular legislation. And to Stan's point as well, I think that if we're going to put numbers that we can put similar ratios to social workers, to mental health counselors, I think that we could if we're going to put numbers, and I see we've got social workers with a number 1 in each building, that we could put that caveat in there as well, 1 per building, or at a ratio of 1 for every 750 students. We could add that where we've created numbers, if that helps. Long answer.
I agree.
Stan, my sense, though, is particularly around guidance counselors and in high schools, that's going to be too high a number.
Absolutely. You know, I think you've got to get it down to more like, you know, going less than 1 to 200 is going to be tough, but you know, it really ought to be 1 to about 100, so that you could really work with those kids and work with their schedules, work with career counseling and everything else. You know, I know that's, you know, obviously that's going to be way low, but at least 1 to 250.
Chris?
Yeah, that's the number that the National Association of Social Workers recommends, 1 to 250. But you know, I guess we can reference and refer to all the national associations that set those benchmarks and put that into our recommendations. I did have one question though: how would we treat elementary schools or any school with 100 students? You know, can that, you know, I guess I don't even know what my question is, but there's certain schools with 2,000 students, ones with 100 students. You know, if we're making the recommendation that each has a nurse, and how do districts make that work considering the job market and the talent pool? You know, I guess, do we take that into consideration as well, or are we setting districts up to fail, or is that just the benchmark we expect? I just wanted to make sure we were aware of that, because I know at least in Knox County we have several schools with 100 to 150 students, and others that have a couple thousand. So how do we make that work?
This is David. I'll jump in. Very good question, Chris. And I think that kind of goes back. I'm thinking of, and I live vicariously through my 10-year-old daughter, and I'm thinking of her school in particular, and she has 270 students in that building itself. There is a school in our community that has, it is one building, it has one class per grade level of pre-K through 5. So there's roughly, for 25, there's 150 students in this class. So I still would like to keep the ratio of one per building and put that funding out there for that school system. I understand that the community talent pool of being able to hire those folks may make it a challenge, but maybe we'll leave an open door for some shared experience, some shared professional knowledge of that smaller 150 student school with a larger 600 person school there. Just leave some flexibility in the hiring.
And not to mention, they're still not that prevalent, but still a few K-12 in small rural communities that really throws those numbers out of whack, because they may not have 300 kids total.
So I'm wondering if to an extent, we have a will of the group around one in each building, and a number, I think we came to 500. And I'm just wondering if we can, and then I think Stan was saying for guidance counselors and college and career advisors, 1 to 250. So that seems where we've ended up, though I think we're not writing legislation, we're writing a report. Doesn't have to be precise. Somebody else is going to have to work out the specifics for some of these questions, I suspect. Ginger, it looked like you were going to help us move forward on this, or no, was I just wishful thinking?
No, I wanted to clarify briefly if it was 1 to 750 or 1 to 500, because I heard 750 and I wrote that, but I wanted to double check if I had that correct. So I have minimum of 1 in each building, then it would move to 1 to 750 beyond once, the minimum was hit. So do I have that ratio correct for the nurses? I'm seeing heads nod, so, okay. And then
I'm sorry, I thought both Lynn and the representative were at 500. Is that right?
And Dan,
Yeah.
thank you. I'll jump in. I think, and Chris had looked up the national norms. I think we're trying to get to the national norm, and as much as I'd like the ratio to be 1 to 500, I think the national norm is 1 nurse for 750. So I think
Okay.
Stuck on that 750 number. And then if we could look at the national norms, maybe we use that language as a national norm, because that could change from year to year and could give flexibility in funding that way.
okay, and then for school and career counselors for high school, we would say the 1 to 250. Again, going back to the National Association ratio. And then I also heard someone mention social workers at the 1 to 250, but I didn't hear a lot of conversation about the social worker part. So are we putting all 3 of those as kind of updates to last meeting's list with these ratios? And do I have all of those correct?
Yeah, the National Association of Social Workers calls for 1 to 250, but also says 1 to 50 for students with intensive needs. So again, I would reference back to all the national associations and use that. And it sounded like, I guess someone shared, and I forgot who it was, that right now our nurse rate is 1 to 3,000. So getting to 750 would be huge. But yeah, I can forward all the National Association data points to you, Ginger.
Okay, that would be great. I can include that in the notes, and I'll just put a kind of a disclaimer at the bottom of ours that says we recommend all of the national recommended ratios for each of the support services, professional support services within our list. Does that sound right to everybody?
But I think we all said at minimum 1, right?
Yes.
1, yeah, okay.
that seems like good progress. Thanks, everybody. Anything else on this list that we want to, our list that we want to I guess I'll add a question that I have and maybe a recommendation. I think at the very bottom of this, Ginger, onto the next page, if you would. I thought we had talked about moving EPSOs to should have, and I guess having heard from some folks who looked at our list and thought about it myself, I'm concerned if we move EPSOs from must have to should have. And I think our logic there was it was going to be an outcome. But I think the problem with that is then you're always a couple of years in arrears for the funding, and you're only providing resources for success. And so I think we should move EPSOs back to a must-have. Stan, I'm seeing your head shake yes. I'm just trying to bring out support.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. Yeah.
Anybody, Scott, was that a yes? A head nod there? Okay. Anybody concerned about that? Okay, thanks. If we could do that. Before I see we've been joined by our expert. Before we move to that portion of the meeting, I'm wondering, anything else on our list, or do we have a list that we're happy with? Okay. I think we'll take silence as general agreement. Terrific. Thanks, everybody. We have with us, and I'm going to ask Ginger to do an introduction of our expert. Just a quick frame. We have an opportunity to ask questions as we think about policy considerations and recommendations. As a group, we've previously talked about a desire around teacher compensation, around the size of the pie, if you will, the adequacy of the investment. We've talked about weights and whether we also, I think, how heavy a weight different weights should or could be, and also the issue of recurring funding, all areas that I think would perhaps be in our recommendations phase. And we have an expert with us. If you have some questions that you'd like some expertise on, this is the 30 minutes or so that we have immediately available to us. So we'll shift to that part of the meeting. Ginger, if you would be so kind, and I know you're only found out in the last hour who is going to be here. So this is going to be an ad hoc introduction, but we're deeply grateful for his time and your introduction.
Yes. So this is Matthew Joseph. Matthew, we are so happy you were able to join us here, and we appreciate your quick shift to be able to be here with us. So as a quick introduction, Matthew is the Senior Policy Advisor at Excel in Ed. He previously worked as a Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So he is spearheading a national initiative to improve strategic use of resources in public education. He's also served as the Executive Director of Advocates for Children and Youth, where he led successful efforts to improve education and other services in Maryland. He also previously served as a Senior Associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation and received his bachelor's from Harvard University. And we are so excited that he is here to join us. So Matthew, I'm going to just turn it over to you if there's anything else you'd like to add to that. And then I'll let you open it up to the group.
No, that's perfect. I'm just happy to be here. And of course, if I don't know the answer to a question, which is always a high probability, given how complex it is, I can find out who could potentially provide the information. So just happy to kind of be here as a resource for you all, even if it's beyond the 30 minutes. You know, we've been, ExcelNet has been, you know, very involved in Tennessee for many years and highly supportive of a lot of the changes that have been taking place, and excited about the opportunity that funding reform can bring to bear on some of these issues. So happy to answer questions or just hear the conversation, whatever is going to be helpful to you all. Happy to do that.
Let's open the floor to questions. Anybody brave and want to start with the first one?
I'll jump in here, Dan, if that's okay.
Sure, please.
And Matthew, again, thank you for being here. We've got an age-old conundrum. Local governments, local school boards want to have autonomy to be able to be nimble and shift funding and put funding in certain areas. But as we're looking at must-haves versus it'd be nice to have levels of funding, as we invest more in the state, or have you seen as greater investments come at a state level, does that cut down on the local control, on the local autonomy? And I've got a reason I asked that. All local school districts, whatever size, want to have the ability to say, we're going to do this with our money and shift this to that, to that, to that. Or does the state just need to come in and say, you need to do X, Y, Z with the money we're giving you?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I would say that it definitely, in states that have a higher proportion of state funding as a total portion, let's say North Carolina, it does become a temptation, you know, about state policymakers to say, well, if we're giving all this money, you know, we need to ensure that it gets spent in a certain way. But that can happen whether it's 10 or 20%. You know, it's really just the appetite of the state policymakers, how forceful they want to be. It's just the higher percentage seems to kind of create the kind of temptation. I just would say, I mean, part of the strength and why we're so supportive of what we call student-centered funding is that we think that the state should be tight on outcomes, but loose on the inputs. And that's really the kind of fundamentals of it, that, you know, you can have all kinds of complicated ways to come up with how much the base should be and how much the weight should be. And many states have done really sophisticated and non-sophisticated ways to figure that out. The question is once the district gets the money, what should be the restraint on how they spend it? And I would say that the general trend for states that are going to student-centered funding, the entire purpose behind it is to be less input oriented, is to say that the state is not in a position to know exactly how the money should be spent. There's too many different circumstances that a district has, that a school has, and they change a lot. You know, and if it's in statute, and all of a sudden a pandemic happens and you don't know what to do, you know, the state, of course, can waive a lot of that stuff. But I just would say that, you know, it is one of the flaws, I would say, that when we see the Tennessee system is that it currently has a heavy input focus. And we would say the state should not be focused on inputs. They should be thinking about how students are doing on a learning perspective, and to have, you know, what we'd say is a fair amount of autonomy on how they spend the money. And I would say there's one caveat and one add-on. The caveat is, generally speaking, if a state is going to provide supplemental weighted funds for certain student populations, there is a significant danger if the state does not require that money to follow the student down to the school in which they serve. I mean, that's happened in Maryland. It's happened in California, where they put into big new formulas with very generous weights for greater need students. It went to the districts. And I'm not saying the districts did anything illegal with the money. They didn't spend it to go on trips to Hawaii. It's just that the appetite of the districts to spend it how they want to spend it is limitless. And they will take that money and they will spend it on general operating expenditures and other big needs that they have. And they will not spend it on the disadvantaged students who really don't have the political power to fight in that battle. And so what Florida has done, states like Florida has done, is said, look, you can spend it how you want it once it gets to the school level, but we're not going to allow you to take all that extra dollars that we provided on the assumption and assertion that certain students need extra more, and you're not going to spend it at all on those students. So they require 90% of the money to follow the student. And I would just add on, and I promise I won't go this long on every question you ask, but I think if a state is really concerned about like how the money gets spent, I would say that first of all, we'd say, there can be state priorities, like say K-3 literacy, that the state's going to say, we've looked at the data, every district in the state's doing poorly, and we're going to put our thumb down on this one. We're going to give you a block of money, and you have to spend it on that because we've just seen a pattern. This need is not being addressed, and so we're not going to just give you freedom. That would be something that has to be an exception, or else you get right back to the current formula where it's like 87 things that the state someone has told the districts to do, and then all of a sudden you're back to where you started with. I would say that it's really in the performance and outcome side of things, that the rewards and structures, that that's really where the state can really start tipping the edge into favor of, we're going to be loose on how you spend the money, but we are going to be really tight on accountability, and we're going to be really tight on rewarding success so that we can kind of drive the ultimate bottom line. So definitely can go deeper and talk about specific states if you have questions about that.
I'm going to rush in since no one else did. I would like to do a follow-up on your comment there. Tennessee has, like many states, but Tennessee has significant gaps. Part of the idea of weighted formula is to try and address some of those gaps. I'm wondering, do you have some exemplar states in terms of right now, the draft formula talks about a heavy weight or a medium weight or a light weight. Well, that's pretty vague. Wondering if there are exemplars of states that have gone to a weighted formula, student-focused weighted formula, and really used the money to close the achievement gap.
Yeah, the states that have really done the most in recent years have been like California with the local control funding formula. I don't know if anyone briefed you on that or not, but that was where they took 50 different categoricals and they collapsed it into a student-centered funding formula with weights, structurally quite similar to the framework that Tennessee is coming up. And then there's Ohio and Illinois. And, I've looked a lot at the different weights. I've been involved in kind of studies on weights. And what I would say is that, honestly speaking, the weights that states have are highly arbitrary. They are very rarely based on any scientific analysis that's been done. Maryland's one of the only states that's ever done anything. So yeah, I can tell you what the weights generally are if you take a look at states that have weights. But I would just say it's looking at an average of highly arbitrary calculations. They're done by how much money is available and just a lot of other things. I think that we think that the two concepts to apply before you get to the actual specifics of the weight in terms of thinking about how big the weight should be is, one is, can you consider the types of additional services that we think certain student populations need? I mean, that gets you into the input space, but not only if you kind of try to derive the actual expenditure that way in terms of, well, we said it should be tutoring in summer school, so you have to spend it on summer school and tutoring. But I think you start to thinking about it. That's what Maryland did. That's what other states do. They think about the types of services and how much do they cost? Is it $500? Is it $1,000? Is it $2,000, generally speaking? And the other is, in an environment where some of these students are going to have choice. I mean, you're going to go to a charter school. I mean, there's lots of different options that might be happening. You want all students to be equally desirable. You want a charter school to go out and grab students. You do not want them to cherry pick. And if every student is flat funded and they're held accountable, then they naturally would try to get the students that are their least advantaged. They don't have the students with disabilities. So the other thing, I guess, is a market concept, which is how big do the weights need to make these students desirable, that a charter school wants to go out and get a disadvantaged student, knowing that they're going to have to spend extra money, and then knowing that they're going to be held accountable for those students. And so I think you end up in a fairly, heavy, that's why you end up in a heavy situation. As soon as you start calculating the cost of tutoring in summer school and reduce class size and think about like, what would the market, $200, $400, it just doesn't go very far. The other thing I just say about weights is just an algebraic thing, is it really, how much money does it produce? Like South Carolina has like, say, a weight of 0.2, but their base is like $2,000 because they don't really fund very much through the formula at all. So when you calculate base times weight, it produces a very small amount of money. So that's where you really want to know, like, what is the base going to be? How much is the weight? Just do the basic math. And it really should produce, like, I would just say the ballpark, if you want to know what the average is for disadvantaged students, it's about $1,000, $1,200. So again, could you prove that that's the right amount of money? The answer is no, because I'm talking about the average of all these other different political calculations. The charter school, by the way, I don't know if you want me to talk about this charter school weight or not, because it's a peculiar one, because it's oriented to facility issues. But I could go into any of those deeper. I could go into, like, because we've done all kinds of work on thinking about weights for students with disability, you know, which is in the framework. So if you want me to go in any deeper, just let me know. And also, I just want to let you know that we have so much material that I mean, not long materials, because we're not like a think tank, but we have lots of deeper resources that we could share with the subcommittee, you know, as a follow-up, you know, based on your desire to kind of look into things a little more closely.
Thanks. I'm going to let others follow and ask some questions as well. I appreciate the comment on the weights, particularly for economic disadvantage. Thanks. And I will follow up and ask for some of those materials. Thanks.
Sure.
Other questions?
I don't know if I have a question as much as a comment about the charter schools. You know, we don't have any charter schools in our county. And you hear things about charter schools picking kids. What a lot of people hear when they hear charter school is private school. And we are not talking about a private school here. That I want to make that clear, right?
Correct. Public schools.
Okay.
They're all public schools.
Yeah. But I think that we need to make sure that the public understands that whenever they talk about a charter school, that they are not talking about a private school being able to reach out and cherry pick kids.
Right.
I so apologize to be late to the game. Hi, Matthew. I'm Katie Court, Nashville. Hi. I don't know if you've already talked about this, but I had an appointment. I could not, but I'm very excited that you're here. 2 questions. The first is on total funding adequacy in the entire package. I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you know, we're in the country, we're very much at the bottom of the effort index. And so what are your thoughts there in terms of a recurring, sustainable amount? And should we be saying, you know, we need this certain amount to be always put into the budget, et cetera? And then my second question was on the direct funding allocation. I'm still a little, we haven't spent a ton of time in the subcommittee talking about that direct funding section, and I'm still a little confused as to why we would put dollars into a direct funding flow as opposed to elevating the base and allowing districts to depend, you know, except in, like, you know, when you have COVID and a pandemic and you need certain, you know, one-stop shop kind of items. I'm curious your thoughts on why a direct funding line item that would cover CTE and other things, and then also the adequacy conversation. So I'm not sure if I was clear, but really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no. You know, the adequacy issue, I mean, gosh, if I could answer that question, I mean, that's why you have litigation, and there's been litigation all over the country. And I can't really answer, like, you know, how much is enough. I mean, I think that we definitely have seen situations where, you know, when you put weighted dollars into disadvantaged populations, that you get better results, you know. But I think that certainly the bulk of work that I have done and Excel has done is to say, like, given whatever money you have, like, how do you structure it to get the biggest bang for the buck? And then we would say, well, and now that you've structured it for the biggest bang for the buck, you can tell policymakers, please put more money in, because it's not just money down the drain. You know, we've structured it in a way that you're going to get value out of it. But how much that should be, you know, I just can't, you know, give you a simple answer on that one. I wish I could. You know, on the direct funding, you know, it is a good question, you know, as to why they have certain things in there and not other things, and ultimately what will be there and what won't be there. I do feel like there should be a logic behind it, and it shouldn't just be like, this is a pet project that was recently put into the law, you know, because there's going to be a pet project every year. There's usually like 5 of them, you know, a year, and then you're going to have like 100 of them, you know, built into the statute, you know, 5 years from now or 20 years from now. So I don't know. I mean, I would say I would say, because I was recently testifying on this in North Carolina, where, you know, they also have a resource-based system with a lot more prescriptions on the spending side of things, is that the state should feel that there are priorities, that if the state decides, like I said with K-3 literacy, that this is a state priority, this is an urgent need. We've looked at the data, It's not being addressed. We have to address it. That there could be a rationale for a state saying, yes, we are going to direct fund $100 million for X, Y, and Z. But I think it should be the rare exception. You know, it should be a clearly articulated reason that doesn't become a loophole, because what's going to happen is that then all of a sudden, like, someone's going to say, well, I think there should be coaches, and I think there should be summer school, and I think there should be this, that, and the other. And then you're going to be back to where it is a system of inputs that is hamstringing autonomy and creativity and all the other stuff that's the whole reason to change it to student-centered funding. You know, the CTE is an interesting thing because, of course, my organization has done a ton of work on career technical education all over the country. It really should be in the base with elements of it in the outcomes. I mean, you know, the way we would say is that it should be a weight in the base, and the weight should be heavily oriented towards the state's only going to fund courses that are high demand, high wage, and all that kind of stuff, in which there's a clear progression on terms of the program of study. So we're not going to fund program X, you know, at the same weight as a program Y if it's just not as meaningful to students. Now, theoretically, that could be the case, but it could be a crappy program that doesn't do anything for the students. That's why it probably should be also in the outcomes part, where you see, like, Texas, you know, I could go on and on about Texas with HB3. They are rewarding districts for career preparedness. So they're not really as strong as they could be. Tennessee could definitely go beyond Texas on this, but basically say, we want to see that industry certification. We want to see some progress, some actual job, you know, that earns a wage. And there's all kinds of stuff you could orient it to there. So I'm not really sure why they have that in there. It could be it's just a grab for all, and they don't really understand that they could put the weights in the system, you know, or maybe they're concerned they would put the weights for CTE and then it wouldn't get spent on CTE. And so all of a sudden you get into the expenditure control side of things. That's really what direct means, is that we're going to tell you how to spend the money. And I think that's a challenge, because, you know, you could have some expenditure control on CTE or anything, but it wouldn't be better if it was more of an outcome. You know, that's what we'd say. Isn't it something that could be better, like designed to say, well, don't spend it on CTE, but man, you are going to get hammered, you know, on the accountability and the outcome side of things. Or maybe you do say you need to spend some of it on CTE. I mean, that you could have an expenditure control side of things, but you could probably put it into the core formula. And I just would say that's another thing about the recurring thing, is as much as possible, the benefit is to have everything be recurring, you know, because you don't want to have battles year after year.
Totally.
So, like, you know, that's the value of the line items, and, you know, that's the value of having weights as opposed to line items, is let it be in there. And if the legislature wants to change it, let them go in and change it if they have to, but otherwise it just happens year after year.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
I'd love to hear what I've heard on this from committee members, and it's absolutely throughout the submitted comments, has to do with educator compensation. And just wondering, from your work, what have you seen? What advice would you offer? There is great concern about teacher compensation in this state, and a strong feeling, at least in the written comments and what I've heard, that we need to do a better job of compensating teachers. Wondering what advice or experience you could add for us.
Yeah, I mean, I can say some things and also pose some questions and issues. One of the issues is, okay, so if the state or someone doesn't feel that the teacher pay is high enough, then what they should be doing is incorporating a higher salary into the base and other things. So that's the way one would address that. Now, the question was, what would happen if the districts took that money under the assumption that, you know, we've said that the teacher salary should be 10% higher, and they don't raise the salaries, you know? And that's really where you get in this conundrum of local control, because this has happened all over the country, where you hear about low teacher pay, and then the governor, whoever, wants to put in a bill that basically says it's going to go to teacher pay. And then you're back to, you know, controlling inputs, when it's really, shouldn't it be up to the districts to decide these issues? And if you're going to give them the extra money and they decide to use it for something else, is it not up to them? Or do you feel like if the state is going to say this is a problem, the money has to go that way, because that is getting you back into the input space? The other thing I would just say is that go back to Texas, for example, is that they were really concerned about teacher pay. So yes, they did two things. They built it higher into the base, into the formula, but they were concerned about the particular challenges that some schools have in attracting the most highly qualified teachers. And so what they did is they built, as part of that outcome system, that they built in a teacher incentive fund where basically if a district has any kind of teacher evaluation system that they feel is, it has to pass some muster. It does not have to be like something that's only about test scores. It's pretty loose. To differentiate teachers, if one of their higher qualified teachers goes and works in a high need school, the state will fund $32,000. If they just go elsewhere, other school to get $3,000. And that differential, that's just happening now over the last 2 years. I think people are going to think that differential could make a huge factor. So it's in addition to the weight, because those schools are also getting weighted dollars for their low income students, but it's addressing a special issue that's really, they didn't feel was being factored into the formula itself, which is that district or that school is having a hard time attracting and keeping the most qualified teachers just because of the nature of the way teachers migrate to certain types of schools and districts. And so they put in that extra factor. And there's quite a lot of material on that in Texas. And I think some of us are super excited. We had the commissioner of Texas speak at our summit, and that was the thing that he was really the most excited about of all the different things that happened in their funding reform, was to address that as a resource. Funding is dollars, but teachers is a whole other resource that needs to be factored in. So are you thinking that the state would be saying, we're going to have a $100 million fund for teacher salaries, but it has to be used for teacher salaries? That's going to be part of the kind of, direct funding or something else? I mean, have you thought about that? Or would you be comfortable if it was folded into the base amount and subject to the discretion of the districts?
We haven't discussed that yet. Representative, you were going to say something wiser than what I just said.
No. I'll just jump in. And Matthew, I do serve the legislature, and I'll jump into the practical approach. And what you explained a few moments ago, we presented a funding mechanism that would give all teaching professionals a 4% raise across the board when those dollars got back to locals, because the dollars were spread across. The intention was the teaching professionals to get that 4% raise, but local governments, in order to give everybody a certain raise, then they had to water that down to a 2 3/4% raise, because they gave some folks that are not in the basic education program formula positions that are not in there. They wanted to give everybody the same raise. So they matched some local dollars with the state dollars, and it took what we suggested was a 4% raise and gave a 2 3/4% raise. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I know that's infuriating, and it infuriates elected officials all over the, because you're promising to address a need, and it's not really getting addressed either way. I just would say that, just to encourage that the shift should always be focusing on the student learning and the outcomes, and as much as possible. I think this is the trap that Tennessee and states like North Carolina, some of the few states that still have resource base, is to always think about inputs and think about what's driving, because we know inputs are important. But I think if you shift backwards and you think about the accountability system, you think about other strategic ways, other levers the state has to address needs, that's something to kind of think about, and not put all the weight into the kind of prescriptive, funding allocations. That's something that I think states have been trying to do. So you would be focusing as much on about like what's going on with the teacher workforce and other broader issues, and the salary could be part of it, but not entirely the issue.
And I've written outcomes down 4 times since I've listened to you speak, and that needs to be, and I think I'm understanding that needs to be what the state focuses on, are the outcomes. And let me take us down another path as we're talking about funding. We've got another issue in Tennessee, and I'm sure other states have this issue as well, blending local funding with state funding. And at a state level, what we've tried to do is gradually increase the teacher salary to increase student outcomes, and put our money where our mouth is, and try to keep and retain our best teachers to do that. So we've made some gradual increases, and hopefully that's going to help us when compared to other states. But when you look at local government and local school board input, And I'll use Amanda and I are from Greenville. If Greenville sees the need to do this, they have been fortunate to be able to fund it. And last night, as a matter of fact, voted a tax increase, or the first step toward a tax increase on local properties in order to fund something for the school system. Many municipalities and counties are not willing to do that. So although if we hit a certain threshold of spending at a state level, all ships will rise there, hopefully, in terms of where we're compared to other states, but you're still going to have that local difference. There's still going to be a local investment where XYZ community is going to spend more or spend whatever it takes because they've got the wherewithal to do that versus some communities that don't. So long setup, but talk about the mesh of local funding and state funding.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I think, with student-centered funding, you always end up with this full pie. You got the base plus the weights, all the different populations, and ends up being a huge pie. And the question should be like, well, how much should the state pay of that pie? How much should the local pay of the pie? So, I mean, I know there's no perfect way. I mean, definitely it's factoring the local wealth. And I know Tennessee has a couple different ways to do that, and states have a million different ways to do that. And so I can't really say what's the best way, but definitely something where it is factoring the local wealth. And then the question becomes, what about the dollars that are outside the formula, that aren't so, there's going to be a requirement, the way Tennessee has it. Some places are 70-30 and some places are 30-70. Great. But then what happens to the localities that are able to fund outside the formula because they're high wealth and the disparities that create there? In Florida, there's very little discretion that districts have to do that, and therefore you don't have a lot of money. But in South Carolina, I mentioned, it's almost all outside the formula. So it's just the Wild West. So I think that's something to think about, like how much local dollars are coming outside of the formula. And, I know in some places, like in Tennessee, some of it's facility related, and is that okay that some places have more money to raise for facilities? And then what about the charter schools? They don't get any of the facility money. So that's why we're enthusiastic about that charter school facility weight. And we're doing a whole separate study over the next month to help kind of explain that. But I don't think I don't know. I'm not answering your question, well about is there some perfect way. But, I think Tennessee actually has had a fairly good system, of like, I know that the specific methodologies and how it kind of alters, it's very complex. It's too complex in Tennessee. But the basic idea that there needs to be kind of a cost sharing, and the higher wealth jurisdictions are going to have higher portion of the cost sharing kind of makes sense. One other thing I just want to say about the local school boards voting on various things is that if the state is going to have more authority and flexibility go down to the local level, there's definitely policies that the state can have along the way, of like mandatory training on fiscal management for superintendents and local school boards. There could be strategic finance plans. There's a whole bunch of things. I have a slide, that shows you the kind of satellite policies. Like, it's not like give them the money and let them do whatever they want. That's really not the approach of student-centered funding. It's to give more flexibility and have other policies that aren't always financial related to kind of help contain it and drive change. And, I think it is a concern that in some localities, like, they never receive any training. They have no idea how to do fiscal trade-offs between, like, I'm going to do 4% for the teachers on this, and I have to compare it to A, B, and C, and what's the best way. Even a lot of superintendents have not received strategic finance training. And so there's a lot of things that a state could do as it's migrating. But my sense in Tennessee is there's already a fair amount of autonomy, because it's not like the BEP is driving the inputs in the same, if you look in North Carolina, you see the same thing as the BEP, but when they get their money for counselors, they have to spend it on counselors. They get their money for tutors, they have to spend it on tutors. Everything has to be reported back line by line. That's not the case in Tennessee. So they're already used to a fair amount of flexibility, and just thinking about like how they can maximize it in a way that produces the decisions that the state doesn't think of as kind of ridiculous from a research perspective or something like that. See, we could just scratch the surface in 30 minutes, right? On such a complex topic.
For sure. Just as you've looked at the draft from the state, wondering if you would make some observations and some suggestions of things we should pay closer attention to, or things we should, really look at.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we looked at the framework, first of all, we were pretty encouraged by it. I'm encouraged by the general direction, it's the student-centered direction. I'm just telling you what our philosophy is. It may not be your philosophy. I mean, we think the outcomes portion of it is strong and it is important. Outcomes can just be 5 or 10%. It does not have to be a huge amount. We would say small but meaningful. But the way it's kind of generally framed as it's there and there's more money for success with economically disadvantaged students is hugely important. In Texas, you get 2/3 more money for success with an economically disadvantaged student. You get $3,000 for someone who's not economically disadvantaged. You get $5,000. If they're economically disadvantaged, you get another $2,000 if they're a student with disability. So that's $7,000 versus $3,000. The weights, it's hard to know what heavy, medium, and light means. I think on the charter school facility one, we're saying, it should be to address the charter school facility gap. I mean, there's a big gap in the state. That's the study we're doing to quantify. Is it $1,000? Is it $500? Once you know what the gap is, you can figure out what the weight is that is necessary to fill that gap, to meet that gap. I don't know that there's a lot, we have a whole list of things. We haven't published anything yet. We have a whole list of kind of like questions and, feedback and ideas. But generally speaking, I think that we're pretty encouraged about the direction and the move towards a student-centered funding formula. And then there's just the devils in the details. There's a lot of like issues, like when we see kind of the language about special education, and we ask like, why 501, 504 plans just for students with dyslexia? I mean, is the state going to go beyond that? How are they going to figure out the weights for students generally with students with disabilities? Just kind of questions, more like questions, kind of like things to think about as the state kind of goes from framework to kind of actual details.
Okay, this is a last call. Any final questions? We have a minute or two, and Matthew, I think you said you were willing to stay. If we held on to you, you'd stay a little longer. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right, Lynn, did you have a question?
I do, and this is sort of outside of what this committee is addressing, but since you have a national perspective on things, I'm encouraged, frankly, that Tennessee is looking at K-12 funding. Can you comment on the disparity between funding K-12 versus post-secondary? We face tremendous funding for post-secondary students, and if they're not prepared for K-12, they're not going to be successful post-secondary. So I'd like to know what the national perspective is on that, Matthew, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that.
Can you just clarify a little bit? You're talking about like how much money to put in K-12 versus post-secondary, or you're concerned about?
Yeah, the state has funded tuition to a great degree for post-secondary students. Most post-secondary students can attend Cleveland or community colleges free of charge. And so, there's a disparity between, I think in Tennessee, there has been, between preparing K-12 students for success versus enabling post-secondary attendance. Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the reasons why we've been so enthusiastic about the Texas system, where they call college, career, military readiness, where that $3,000, $5,000, it attaches to post-secondary success readiness. So there's college readiness, military enlistment, or career readiness, and they have different ways of measuring that. And but for college, you have to be actually enrolled in college. What we'd say is that's why I say Tennessee could go further. They could say it's not just about enrollment. Did you at least get through the first year in an okay format? Or it's not just about career that you pass some certification. Did you actually get a job 6 months afterwards? And so to kind of go into the actual, not just preparedness, but actual success, you can't go through go through 4 or 6 years, because then the lag in funding is so long. I mean, like the K-12 system can't wait. There are some higher ed, Tennessee has it, where a big block of the money is based on outcomes, post-graduation outcomes, but there's just too long a lag for it. But I would say that in Tennessee, like if there was money, again, it's not about putting 50% of the money in K-12. It's about, can that be a 5 or 10% on top of what's already there. And what we have found is that 5 or 10% in other states will hugely drive change. It will drive, Florida did something for AP courses. Everyone said, you could not have AP courses in all these schools. There's all these kids, they're not qualified, they're so far behind in math, they're never going to do it. So they put in a weight in the formula for every AP exam that's passed, and all of a sudden it went over 10 years, 10x, so it does drive change. And it wasn't like that's what I would say is, to kind of put more money into the system. And the thing that's interesting about Texas is that the total theoretical tab was $1.5 billion if every student hit the qualification for post-secondary success. But of course, they looked at their data and only like 20% of the kids are doing it. So right now the cost is like $200 million, $250 million. But policymakers have said, we would be delighted if it cost us the full $1 billion, because that would mean 75% of the students are actually hitting the mark. And then the return on investment that we've calculated for that is so huge for the post-secondary and tax and everything like that. We're going to be happy to spend. So that's some of the benefits of outcomes funding that's linked to student learning, is that it's not something that the state has to pay unless actually there's some kind of sign that something's happened. And then usually that something happened is like a good thing. And people are happy that more kids are prepared for post-secondary success.
Your comment earlier, though, was how important it is that the weights come through on the outcomes, that they are heavily weighted to students who have not been successful in the past. I thought that's what I heard. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, there's two things. There's the weights that are in the core formula. You get them because you're economically disadvantaged. There's nothing outcome oriented to that. I mean, you are economically disadvantaged, you're a student with disability. There's an additional weight. It's $1,000, whatever is attached. Then there's the add-ons for outcomes and whatever that should be. Then what we would say is, like in Texas, that if you are successful with a student who has higher needs, that should be the bigger bump, And
a weighted outcome. A weighted outcome in effect.
But it's still not attached to prior poor performance, because that seems to kind of reward districts that are doing poorly. It's still usually attached to something that's an immutable characteristic of the student. It is that they're economically disadvantaged, they're a student with disability. And when that success happens, the district gets, 50% more of the money, but to have it because they were behind, kind of means like, well, the more behind we are, the more money we get, that would be that would be perverse. So then other people say, well, how do you make sure the rich don't get richer in an outcome-based system? And the way you do that is by having a big extra weight of funding for success. And so we have a modeling tool, which we could show you all, where we said, like, what happens if you put in a weight? And you see what happens. Yeah, the districts that have more disadvantaged kids, they do have fewer students who hit those outcomes. That's just realistic. That's highly predictable. But because they get so much more money per student for that success, they get equity. They get the same amount of money. They don't get treated poorly, or unfairly to the other districts who are having more students hit those benchmarks, but they get less money for them. And so that's just a basic concept that, and it's in that language. You can see in the framework, it does say that in the framework. That's the intent of the state to do that.
Thanks. I think we're probably at time here.
Well, Ginger knows where to find us. We're longstanding partners, with you all and with the legislature, and just, if there are things, I'm sorry if I can't have gone as deep or answered the questions in the best way, but, give me a little more time or follow up, and I'm happy to kind of be supportive, or reach out to my colleagues who oftentimes know a lot more about things than I do.
Well, Matthew, we thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and opinions with the subcommittee today. It's been super helpful for them, and helping them think about some additional considerations as we continue through this process. So we really appreciate your time and rearranging your schedule to be with us today.
Happy to. That's why I'm here.
Thank you.
Take
care. I could hold the committee members for just a couple more minutes, that would be great. Thank you. So I think we had said we were going to stop in about 5 minutes, and I suspect that's what everybody will need to do. There's some other work we do need to do, and Ginger, help me here on the fly. Should we just assume we're going to start next week by looking at the draft funding formula and see if there's anything we want to add, and then begin to talk about some policy recommendations. Is that the best way for us to go next week?
Yeah, I think our main focus for next week will be those policy pieces, but we can spend a few minutes, jumping back to that draft framework since we did not get to do that today. But if you all can spend some time between now and next week, I know that's pretty quick turnaround, but spend some time looking at that. If you have some additional thoughts, we can spend a few minutes at the next meeting discussing those pieces, and then we'll move quickly into the policy considerations, which you all have in the Google Drive on the meeting 5 recommendations document. You'll see those already listed. They are some of the ones that we definitely want to have some discussion about. Some will be easier to talk about in this group than others, just based on, background and all of that stuff. So please spend some time looking at those, so we'll have a good place to start next time.
That sounds good. A couple, we have also, some of these did not come up in what is in the document Ginger just referred to, but we've talked about, which are, again, the issues around teacher compensation, for example. I think that is actually in the group that came from meeting 5. I guess I'd like to ask the group, in case we do not get finished in an hour next week, I'm just wondering, and I'll send this to y'all in an email, wondering if the next day, I think that would be Thursday, the 27th, if people could put aside this hour, whether it's 11:30 to 12:30 or 12:30 to 1:30 for you. And if you can, I'd like, Ginger, I think that's acceptable, right? We could have another meeting. I know we're supposed to be getting close to done, but I'd like us to put aside that time rather than scramble at the last minute next week and find we need some more time. Is that okay?
Yes, as long as it works for everyone. And I'll need to check my schedule also and see if we're all available.
Okay. All right, I'm going to assume silence is a good thing on this one. And
I'm just looking for the policy doc and just had asked Ginger to share I'm just struggling to figure out which one it is in the Google Drive.
Yes, I was trying to type it in there and also look at calendars, and I'm failing at both. It's listed as the Education Foundation's recommendation meeting number 5. And it's the last couple pages of that. If I can get Google to pull up quickly, I'll paste the direct link to it in here. Try that link. Excellent.
And we'll send out a sort of an overview on Monday, just as a reminder to everybody for our work on Wednesday and maybe Thursday. All right. Okay. Any last words from anybody for the good of the order? All right. Thanks, everybody. Do your best to stay well, and we'll meet again next week about this time. All right.
Thank you, Dan.
Good.
Thanks, everybody. Stay well.
Yeah.